Public-private partnerships. How can PPPs deliver better services? Evaluating a project for PPP viability and project risks.
During the previous 2 weeks, you've been looking at the role of public-private partnerships and the institutions and frameworks required to make public-private partnerships work. And now we are ready to work at the project level. We are ready to start understanding the process for actually procuring a public-private partnership partner for our individual, for a specific project. So why does a private sector partner want to join a public-private partnership project? Fundamentally, they are driven by the desire to earn a reasonable rate of return for the time, investment of money, and effort that they put into the project. They might indeed also be motivated by the desire to create infrastructure for society, to be able to add value to the community, but the organizing principle behind the public-private sector partners' desire to join a PPP project would rest on the desire to participate in a commercially viable project that would generate a return, a reasonable return for the equity investor, for the lenders to the project. And what does it take for that commercial viability to be established? What must the public authority do to be able to show and demonstrate to potential partners that the project is commercially viable? That is the subject matter. That is one of the important constituents of the document which is usually called the detailed feasibility report, which has to be prepared at this stage. The commercial viability of a project depends first and foremost on being able to demonstrate a robust cash flow in the years to come, a robust revenue stream that would contribute to the commercial viability of the project, which would be enough to cover the operating and maintenance costs of the project during its life and generate enough surplus which can then be used to service the debt and the equity investments in the project. The life of the project, by the way, is usually called the concession period. So in the case of a BOT project, for example, the revenues from the tolls would be an important component of establishing the commercial viability of the project, and the cost of maintenance and operating the road would be the operating costs. The surplus would then have to service the initial investment in creating the capital asset itself. The road project's ability to generate tolls in the future, in turn, has to be established by showing the demand projections of traffic, which in turn would require traffic service to be undertaken, willingness to pay to be established among the consumers or the users of that road, traffic assignment models that would show how traffic would be assigned from other competing routes to this road, and so on. Let us now turn to the issue of risks. It is indeed meaningless to talk about the expected returns without evaluating the risks involved. A high expected return will not generate much satisfaction if it is accompanied by a great deal of risk associated. The types of risks that infrastructure projects are exposed to are very many. The construction cost itself could go out of control. The prices of raw materials, such as steel and cement, could vary greatly. There can be cost and time overruns. Projects like irrigation canals or hydropower projects very often suffer from major geological surprises. The traffic risk that we've already talked about, how much water will be consumed by the consumers of a water supply project, how much electricity will be consumed by the consumers of a generation project or a distribution project. The cost of debt could completely go out of whack if there is a movement, a sharp movement in the variable interest rates. If you've taken debt in foreign currency, you run a foreign currency risk if your currency depreciates a great deal. Political risks are endemic. Governments can very often, under political pressure, bow to public demands for reduction of tariffs, to changing of land laws, and so on. In extreme cases, governments have been known to even nationalize or take over public-private partnership projects in the real or imaginary belief that that is in national interest. Social unrest led by either ideological conflicts or environmental concerns or dissatisfaction with the land acquisition process can also haunt a public-private partnership project. So, how can such risks be managed? And how do you demonstrate to the private sector partner before you procure the project that you have a plan for managing such risks? The detailed feasibility report usually contains a comprehensive risk matrix to account for such risks. Management of risk rests essentially on three pillars: identification, mitigation, and allocation of risks. The idea is, first and foremost, to identify all risks, not to go into a project blind. Then, by generating as much information as possible about each of those risks, you try to mitigate the risk. You try to bring the risk down by bringing greater certainty into the project. For example, traffic or demand risk. The more studies you do, the more sophisticated analysis you do to be able to project demand into the future, you are lowering the risk, you are mitigating the risk. But having done all that, risk cannot be eliminated. Therefore, at the end of the day, we have to figure out how to allocate those risks. As you know, there are many partners, there are many parties involved in a public-private partnership project. There is the project sponsor or the private sector partner himself, there are the equity investors, the lenders, the contractors, the operators, the consultants, and so on. So the risks have to be then, in turn, allocated among the various parties, various stakeholders in a public-private partnership project. The golden rule about the issue of allocating risk is that you allocate every risk to the entity that is best positioned to manage that risk. Because if the risk is inappropriately allocated, if the risk is forced on an entity that is not in a position to manage that risk, it will eventually price that risk. That entity will price that risk, which will eventually add to the project cost and indeed create a lose-lose situation rather than a win-win situation. Take the case of a road project. It is common for the concessionaire to be asked to take on the traffic risk. It is common for the concessionaire to be asked to live with the demand risk. But traffic projections are notoriously fickle. The Delhi-Noida bridge project to the east of Delhi, in year 7 of its existence, was still struggling to achieve the traffic which had been projected to be reached in year 2. And these were traffic studies done by the best and the brightest from around the world. On the other hand, on the other extreme, the Delhi-Gurgaon project, which is to the west of Delhi, in the first year when the project was inaugurated, saw traffic which had been projected to arrive many, many years later. So traffic projections can go seriously wrong. So how do we do this? How do we handle this risk? Is appropriating that risk or allocating that risk to the private sector partner the best way of handling it? Maybe not. It could actually be counterproductive. It may be more sensible to figure out another way of sharing that risk. For example, between the concessionaire and the government. At the end of the day, the golden rule remains. Every risk should be allocated to the party, to the entity that is best positioned to manage that risk. And that is the ideal way of ensuring a win-win situation. In summary, the detailed feasibility report, which is a critical principal document in the process of procuring a private sector partner, will include information on the feasibility of the project, will include information on the assessment of the risks, a plan for mitigating and allocating these risks, would include instruments for strengthening project viability, and is therefore a key document in the procurement process. Before we conclude, however, let me make one last point. This detailed feasibility report does not, however, make the public authority liable to ensure commercial viability. In good faith, the public authority will do due diligence, will provide information, but it is for the private sector to validate the data provided, the information provided, and to explore other ways of improving the viability of the project. The government here is a purchaser of services. It is not to be overly prescriptive about how the project is to be implemented. In fact, indeed, this output-based approach of the public-private partnership strategy is to ensure the greatest benefit of private sector innovation, of technological and managerial efficiencies for the project. So we don't want to be overly prescriptive, and we don't want to say This detailed feasibility report tells you exactly what's going to happen. This tells you how to do things. It is for the private sector partners, for the potential bidders for the project, to find out more optimum ways if that's what they would like to do. Thank you.
This has been an Open Learning Campus presentation brought to you by the World Bank Group, accelerating solutions through learning.